Welcome everybody to my YouTube channel. I would like to try and use this channel to talk about different topics that we're not necessarily addressing with the sermons on the Northborough Church of Christ YouTube channel. But I do encourage anyone who's on here to go to the Northborough Church of Christ YouTube channel and listen to the sermons and go there for edification. But you can also come here now too, and we'll see how this goes. I don't plan on having long classes and messages, probably 20 minutes, the longest. So hopefully this can be of some benefit to you, and we'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll evolve into something that we can put more time, and I can put more time and effort into. But today I'd like to talk about boundaries. What are they? What are they not? What am I responsible for? What am I not responsible for? I'd like to entitle this series, or these series of classes for the next few weeks or however long we go, SOUL-cial Distancing, SOUL, SOUL-cial Distancing. Because think about it, I mean, have you yet to go down the wrong way in an aisle yet in a supermarket? Just simply because you forgot to look down and look at what direction the arrow was pointing? I know I've done that, and I've gotten those looks, the under the breath comments because I'm heading the wrong direction. I try to realize it. As soon as I realize it, I turn around and start going the right way. But maybe you've done that. What about maybe you've done this? Maybe you've had to go back to your car to get your mask. Have you done that? Or maybe you've had to go back into your house before you took off in your car to make sure you had a mask so that you can enter a public place. We're trying to be responsible and be respectful of the restrictions that public places have put into place so that we can be safe and reduce the transmission of the coronavirus. Some of us, without even thinking twice, have limited our access to other people, how we contact them and who we contact. And rightfully so, because we care about our health, don't we? We care about our physical health, and we also care about the health of other people. So we don't want to be at risk, and we don't want to put other people at risk. Sometimes as Christians, we neglect the spiritual aspect of setting these boundaries. Maybe it's because we fear the response of some people. Maybe we fear that they'll give us a good tongue lashing as to how selfish we are because we've said no. Or maybe we feel guilty. Have you ever gone into a department store, say, and when you get up to the register clerk, what is one of the things that they ask you? Did you find everything you're looking for? You say yes, or if you haven't, you say no. But then they also ask you what? Would you like to sign up for a credit card? Have you ever felt guilty in that moment? I hope not. Knowing that you have to say no, or that you're going to say no because you don't need another credit card. But some of us, we may even feel guilty in those moments. But understand, that person understands that they have the potential to receive a no answer. They asked the question. And so we don't have to feel guilty. Some of us, we have no problem at all, right? Nope, not today. I don't need another credit card. And what we'd like to do today is try to ease some of that guilt and some of that fear. Try to see, what are boundaries? What are we talking about? Are we talking about being self-absorbed? Are we talking about being selfishly ambitious? Are we talking about not loving our neighbor and not carrying our cross? When we talk about boundaries as a Christian, what are we talking about? In the physical world, we know that there's boundaries. How long can you hold your breath? We know that we have a boundary as humans that we can't go into the sea for long periods of time. We will die. It's a boundary. We know that there's certain limits as far as we can explore in space. Without oxygen, we will die. Without the atmosphere that we have in the earth, we would die. We are land creatures. Physically, we have boundaries. You think about if you own property. You know where your boundary ends, your property line, and you know when someone else's property begins and when theirs ends, where theirs ends. We deal with boundaries every day. The two yellow lines in a road help us to identify how far we can go to the left and how far we can go to the right. Boundaries are all around us every day. We set boundaries for our children. And when they exceed those boundaries, there's usually a consequence. Boundaries, God has even established for us, not only in creation, but in forgiveness in heaven. It's not as if we just receive forgiveness, is it? We have to believe. We have to confess that we're sinners. We have to repent. Right? There's things that we are responsible for. Not that we earn or can earn forgiveness, but there are things that God has established. And then you think about heaven. Revelation tells us that nothing unclean shall enter therein. There's an obvious, clear boundary. When it comes to spiritual boundaries, though, those are sometimes harder to see. But they're there and they need to be there. So what are boundaries? Boundaries show us what we are responsible for. If you turn to 1 Timothy 5:8, Paul tells Timothy this: "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Paul is giving a clear boundary. Now we know this, right? We know we're responsible for our own families. It's not hard to see. Just by where we live, we know that we have a responsibility to our own household. We're separated from one another. But we understand, we can begin to see now that boundaries are a part of who we are, even as Christians. They're biblical. And Paul makes a clear boundary here that if someone doesn't take care of his own, he's worse than an unbeliever. It's pretty hard. It's pretty harsh words, but they're true. Also in 2 Corinthians 5, not only are we responsible for our own household, but we are responsible for our own lives. And you say, well, this is all obvious, brother. Why are you telling us this? I'm trying to establish for us that boundaries are biblical. In verse 10, we'll start in verse 9, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 9. "Therefore we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad." Each one. I'm not going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ on your behalf. And you're not going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ on my behalf. You're going to stand there and give an account for your life, as will I. Clear boundary. Boundaries show me where I end and where someone else begins. In the book, Boundaries, by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, it says this on page 31. Boundaries define us. They define what is me and what is not me. A boundary shows me where I end and someone else begins, leading me to a sense of ownership. And if we're able to establish these clear boundaries, we will have that sense of ownership. And what is common in our culture today? Entitlement. There's so many people that feel they are entitled to other people's things. You think about adultery, you think about coveting, you think about all of those things. A desire for someone else's belongings. They have a thwarted view of what boundaries are. Think of my wedding ring. My wedding ring is a clear sign to everyone without me saying a word that I belong to someone. It is a necessary boundary, isn't it? They help us to take ownership of ourselves. That's what boundaries are. They help us to show, and they show us what we are responsible for. But they also show us what we are not responsible for. Matthew 18, we'll start in verse 15. If your brother sins, now pay attention to this one. This is important. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. You see the boundary there? If someone sinned against you, you have a responsibility and an opportunity to try and fix it. But it is ultimately up to the person who has sinned against you to fix it. And if it's reasonable to sit down and have a conversation with them, and if they refuse to repent, and if they refuse to acknowledge it, then Jesus' own words are, treat him like a tax collector and sinner and Gentile. It doesn't mean we stop loving them. It doesn't mean that we can't still show kindness. But there is a difference of relationship that occurs. There is a change in that relationship. It's okay for me to say, no, this behavior is not acceptable. We do that with our kids. Why do we stop doing it as adults? So boundaries help us to understand what is not our responsibility. We are to speak the truth in love. It does not mean that we can speak however we want to at the expense of other people's emotions. That's not what we're talking about at all. We need to speak the truth in love. And if we've done that, and we've come from a place of genuine truth, and the answer is still no, then it's the other person's responsibility to respond appropriately. Because if it's coming from a place of love from me, and it's coming from a place of truth, biblically, then no longer am I responsible. I've spoken the truth in love. It's come from a place of truth and love. And the other person wants to respond in a hateful, mean way, then that's on them. And I shouldn't feel guilty about how they've responded. If they've gotten sad, if they've gotten angry, if they pull back from me. Put the shoe on the other foot. Do you like being told no? We should be at a place in our lives as Christians where no is okay sometimes. I'm okay with someone telling me no. I'm okay with someone telling me that my behavior is not acceptable. And it may not make me feel good at the moment. It may not make me feel like I want to be around that person. But if I give myself some thought, give myself some time to think, and I trust that the place that that person's coming from is love and truth, then maybe something's wrong with my boundary if I respond in an inappropriate way. That makes sense, right? So I'm not responsible necessarily for how other people reply to me. Now, if I'm coming from a mean, hateful, unloving, unchristian way, then I've sinned against that person. And boundaries in no way gives me a right to verbally fillet somebody, right? When you think about what boundaries help me to see with regard to what I'm not responsible for, I'm not responsible for the self-control of other people. With our kids, we help train them. We help raise them so that they can be people of self-control, right? But as adults, they need to learn how to be self-controlled. It doesn't mean I don't lend a hand. It doesn't mean I don't lovingly instruct and encourage, but I'm not responsible for their self-control. I'm responsible for my self-control. In Galatians 5:22 and 23, for the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and others control? No. Self-control. I am not responsible for other people having self-control. Think about this. God enables us and God allows us to have free will, does he not? Think about Genesis 2 for a minute. Genesis 2:15. From any tree of the garden, Adam, you may freely eat, except one. God has established a boundary, but he's also given Adam the freedom to choose. He tells Adam, the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. God has established a boundary, and he's established a consequence when the boundary is broken. We do that for our kids. So when we think about God giving us the choice, God says you live however you want to. You can live for the lust of your flesh, you're going to reap corruption. Or you can sow to the Spirit, and from the Spirit you'll reap eternal life. In Galatians 6, 7, and 8. And God won't be mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he shall also reap. And when we try to live outside of that reality, problems and pain ensue. And God gives us the freedom to choose the way we live. But he doesn't control us. He could, but he encourages us through his word, through the help of his Spirit, to have what? Self-control. The fruit of the Spirit is self-control. And I am not responsible for your self-control, and you're not responsible for my self-control. And that's part of the problem. We try to control other people. That's an unhealthy boundary. Well, you don't understand. I want to make them perform and behave in a certain way. Well, if they're an adult and they have a sound mind, they need to take, that's their responsibility. It doesn't mean we can't help, again, but that's their responsibility. Just think of God and how he responds and treats us. It's not going to force us to have self-control. He will help, will encourage, and allow for the consequence if there is no self-control. In 2 Timothy 3, think about this. Paul tells Timothy this, but realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control. Without self-control. Brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And we see that these folks, these people who are like this, lovers of self rather than lovers of God, treacherous, reckless, without self-control, they will not be in the Father's house. Jesus said it, John 14. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. And God says, no, this behavior is not acceptable here. So what are boundaries? Boundaries help us to see what is our responsibility and what isn't. But boundaries are not a license to be self-absorbed. They're not a license for us to not love our neighbor as ourselves. And they're not a license to not let anyone on our property, spiritually speaking. If you turn to Matthew 22, 36 through 40, Matthew 22, 36. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. And if I were to ask you what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, what would you say? Well, it means to be willing to sacrifice. It means being willing to help out when there's an opportunity. It means treating them as you would want to be treated. All those are true. And boundaries isn't a license to not do that. Boundaries actually, when they're done properly and healthy, boundaries enable us to love our neighbor as ourselves, to be selfless, to be willing to give more, not to hinder that, but enable us to do it even better. What does it mean to love our neighbor anyway? Imagine if you had a neighbor and every day they came and knocking on your door. And what they said to you was, I'm just loving my neighbor as myself. After a while, that would get old, wouldn't it? And it's not because we don't love our neighbor. It's not because we don't want and wish good for their lives. It doesn't mean that at all. The Proverbs speak to this actually in Proverbs 25. Proverbs 25:17. Let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will become weary of you and hate you. So is the proverb right or wrong? No, it's not wrong. Generally speaking, let our foot not be in our neighbor's house. Rarely. So what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? Jesus loved his neighbor. And he was willing to give of himself. But he also understood what he was not going to allow. And if anybody wanted forgiveness, he granted it. But they had a responsibility, didn't they? You think about certain individuals who never asked for forgiveness in the scriptures. You think they walked away thinking that they could continue in the same way they lived? I doubt it. If anything, Jesus gave us the example of the adulterous woman. He said, I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. And say, well, didn't Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? Yes, he did. For what purpose? So that he would become like them, so that he would take on their character and their personality? No. So that he could influence them to take on his character and personality. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 5, if anything causes you to stumble, if your eye causes you to stumble, if your hand causes you to stumble, or your foot, to cut it off. Because it's better to go into life, blind and lame, than to be cast into hell. And sometimes we need to do that in relationships, as hard as it may be. Because if we're the one being influenced, and we're being influenced to live like the world, then it needs to be cut off for a while. That's a boundary. The boundaries are not a license to not love our neighbor as ourselves. And they're not a license to be selfishly ambitious, to be self-absorbed, right? In Philippians 2, therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there is any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interest of others. See, boundaries isn't a license to be self-absorbed. We need to consider the needs of others, the interests of other people. That's what Jesus did when he came and died for us. What we needed forgiveness. And what we were able not to carry, he carried it for us. Our sin. He made him who knew no sin to become sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Jesus Christ took upon your sin and mine, burdens we could not bear. But then with that, there are things, there are burdens, there are responsibilities that we do bear and that we are expected to bear. But not without help. And to not let anyone in or on our property. Boundaries are not a license to not let anyone on our property. You think about the good that has been able to come into your life, into your heart, into your mind, because you've allowed your boundary to have a gate in it. You've allowed the good to come in, those helpful relationships. You've allowed God to come in. You've allowed Christ to come in, right? What he tells the church in Revelation. I stand at the door and knock. You have to let him in. And then we also have to let bad things out. We have sin in our lives. It's got to go. Boundaries is not an excuse to put up a wall, to wall off people. We let the good in and keep the bad out. And we kick the bad out, keep the good in. This is just a short introduction class on what boundaries are and what they are not. We've changed our lives this year, haven't we? In some ways, we've been forced to. We've tried to do it because we see the benefit for our physical health. We don't feel guilty about it. We shouldn't. We're trying to do what we think is best to protect ourselves and to protect others. In spiritual boundaries, we can do the same thing. Protect ourselves and protect others. And I pray that as we go along here, and we'll see how this turns out, that we're all encouraged to implement some of these things in our lives so that we can be those who can love our neighbor as ourselves, who can determine where I or you end and where someone else begins. And simply to realize that we live with boundaries every single day and that they can be biblical and that they are. God bless you. And if you would like to continue to see videos that I post on my own YouTube channel, then please feel free to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notifications. I'm not going to promise that I'll send out a class every week. I don't know how this is going to go. It's sort of experimental at this moment. So God bless. Pray it's been an encouragement to you, and look forward to talking with you again real soon. Take care.